It is 11 o'clock now, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to start by just introducing myself. So I just want to say good morning to everybody, and thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Georgia Carr. I am the Disability Inclusion Fellow with the Kresge Foundation. I use she, her pronouns. And for a physical description, I am a white woman with reddish wavy hair. I'm wearing a green long sleeve shirt and I'm sitting in front of a white wall. And my access needs are being met today with the closed captions options. So we'll start this session with some brief opening remarks. So I will go ahead, and I think Phyllis is going to give us some opening remarks. So Phyllis, if you are ready.
Thank you, Georgia. I'm standing in briefly for Rip Rapson, who's a president of the Kresge Foundation. I think he's working on getting the technology together and hopefully will join us shortly. But in his absence, I'd like to, first of all, welcome each and every one of you to what we think is a very important session. The Kresge Foundation has been delighted to be able to bring on for our disability inclusion work, Georgia Carr, who's your host today for this session. I want to thank our speakers, Dessa Cosma, our very own Dessa from Detroit, Marq Mitchell, and Mordecai Cohen Ettinger, who's heralding bravely from the West Coast to join us for this session. I also want to recognize our partner for the day, the Disability Philanthropy Forum, and thank them for their support in helping to organize and put us in touch with the great folks who you're going to hear from today. And obviously acknowledge our event organizers, Georgia Carr, who you'll hear from, Chris LaFleur, who's a senior fellow and a presidential fellow with the Kresge Foundation, and myself. I've been delighted to be a part of planning today. Just to reinforce that disability inclusion is very critical to the mission of the Kresge Foundation. We've dedicated the last several years trying to honor the Disability Inclusion Pledge that we and many other foundations across the country have signed on to. We are a participant on the President's Disability Council in Philanthropy, and see this as an important agenda, not only to include, to be more inclusive, but to also recognize the justice implications that are embedded in the work for people who live with disabilities. We know that 1 in 4 adults in the United States have a disability, whether they acknowledge it or whether it's physical. There's so many levels of work that we need to be sensitive to. And we also recognize that there are systemic barriers to keep people with disabilities in a disadvantaged situation. And there's much work we all need to do in philanthropy and in the nonprofit sector to assure that all people have the opportunity to be successful in society. So just reinforcing our commitment, welcoming all of you, and really thanking our speakers for what I know will be a powerful session. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Georgia, who will move us through the rest of the day.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Phyllis, for that lovely on-the-fly introduction. So thank you. So I just want to go over logistics very quickly. So we're going to ask that everybody remain on mute if you are not speaking, just so we can make sure that there's no background noise, so that our captioning can work properly. And so throughout the day, we're going to hear from 3 different amazing speakers, and they will each talk about disability justice, systemic barriers, and then ways that philanthropy and nonprofits can work to promote the disability justice work. So now I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Chris LaFleur, to introduce our speakers.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Christopher LaFleur. I am the Special Assistant to the President at the Kresge Foundation. I'm very pleased to be here today with our esteemed panel. I am a light-skinned individual with a ponytail and a red flannel button-up. So, and right now I will jump into our bios. And I will start with Dessa Cosma, who is the founder and executive director of Detroit Disability Power. Dessa grew up in the Deep South, splitting her time between New Orleans, Louisiana, and Augusta, Georgia. She's been a social justice advocate for as long as she can remember, starting her environmental, LGBTQ, and reproductive justice efforts in high school. She attended the University of Georgia and earned bachelor's degrees in international affairs, women's studies, and anthropology. After graduation, Dessa moved to Detroit to work as the senior field organizer for Planned Parenthood affiliates of Michigan. In 2014, Dessa graduated with a Master of Social Justice from Marygrove College. At that time, she was the Michigan Program Director for the Center for Progressive Leadership, training hundreds of activists, candidates, and campaign managers across the state. She then became Executive Director of the Economic Justice Alliance of Michigan, which she helped to start in collaboration with some of Detroit's most dedicated economic and racial justice champions. Since 2017, Dessa has been a facilitator with Allies for Change, which provides anti-oppression education, training, and resources for individuals and organizations committed to social change. She was the University of Michigan Center for the Education of Women plus Twink Frey visiting social activists from 2017 to 2019, and is a founding design team member of the Transforming Power Fund. In 2018, Dessa started Detroit's Disability Power to grow the organizing power of the disability community and to continue bridging the gap between the disability community and larger social justice movements. She has particular interest in disability-focused political work that is grounded in anti-racism and economic justice. Next, we have Marq Mitchell, founder of Chainless Change. Marq Mitchell is the CEO and founder of Chainless Change, an emerging recovery community that serves South Florida. Marq identifies as someone in recovery from behavioral health conditions and the criminal legal system. Before the age of 22, Marq spent 7 years incarcerated. As the child of incarcerated parents, he entered the foster care system at an early age. His life trajectory was forever impacted by the school to prison pipeline and the child welfare system. Because of Marq's experiences, he has extensive knowledge of the challenges that justice-involved people face. Although Marq overcame these barriers, he knows that for many, there is simply no second chance. Marq majored in business administration and served as the operations manager for an HVAC company prior to launching Chainless Change. And last, we have Mordecai Cohen Ettinger, the development director of Sins Invalid and also the executive director of Health Justice Commons. Ettinger has over 25 years experience as a multi-sector social justice activist and organizer, holistic healer, fundraiser, and radical scholar and educator. Mordecai is the founding director of the Health Justice Commons and co-founded the TGI Justice Project. They are adjunct faculty at the California Institute of Integral Studies, where they teach critical science, technology, and medicine studies. Schooled by years of movement work and trained in somatic experiencing, Reiki, and craniosacral therapy, they have studied with Dr. Peter Levine, founder of Somatic Experiencing, and Dr. Brezel van der Kolk. Mordecai is crip, queer, and trans non-binary. They are a survivor of radiation poisoning, something designated by the UN to be medical torture. They are here advancing disability justice for our futures to be possible. Thank you. And with that, I will turn it over to Mordecai.
Good morning, everyone. This is Mordecai Cohen Ettinger speaking. I am a person with white skin, a prominent forehead and nose, and wavy gray and brown hair that is pushed behind my ears. I'm really grateful and moved to be here with all of my fellow panelists who have done amazing work in the disability justice field and racial justice fields. And I'm grateful to be here with all of you. And I'm going to be speaking about what disability justice is and why it is so essential in these times. And it's impossible to talk about disability justice without, I think, talking about two core things. One is ableism and how pervasive and pernicious it is. and two, the disability rights movement, without which disability justice would be impossible. So both of those things are really essential. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about how ableism is impacting those of us here in the United States and quite frankly, all of humanity in these times. So ableism is one of the most entrenched and pernicious forms of oppression currently facing US society across state lines and localities, and arguably the entire globe. It's inextricably entangled with other types of oppression and structural violence, which threaten not only humanity, but our very planetary future. The systematic oppressions that unfortunately we are all too familiar with, and many of us are surviving on a daily basis, include white supremacy and racism, patriarchy and sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ageism, and fat phobia. It's impossible to understand or transform ableism or understand what disability justice is and why it is so important without acknowledging that the currents of the oppressions that I just named are currents that persistently run through and amplify ableism's destructive power and harm. Sins Invalid defines ableism as a system of discriminatory practices and beliefs that maintain and perpetuate disability oppression, assigning inferior value or worth to those of us who have developmental, emotional, physical, or mental health impairments. Ableism is always racialized, gendered, and heterosexist, and it is co-constructed or happens simultaneously with white supremacy and racism and the other conditions of the extractive economy that we live in, because unfortunately, the economic conditions that we are in are oriented towards exploiting us, exploiting our labor and the creative forces that we are capable of generating. So, and ableism really plays out both at the interpersonal levels and at the institutional and systemic ones. It's really one of the most prominent ways in which ableism galvanizes its power is by normalizing beliefs and attitudes that illness or disability stem from deep personal unworthiness, flaws, dirtiness, or even impurity. These beliefs, when enacted by institutions or governmental powers, lead to the justification of profound discrimination, surveillance, confinement, withholding of healthcare, such as the medical rationing that we saw, particularly in the early days of the pandemic, because it is still ongoing, and to outright eugenics. And ableism has been very dangerously on the rise during the pandemic. And this, along with the ongoing threats of environmental racism and climate crisis, have really put disabled communities in the crosshairs of profound threats to our livelihood. So that's a little bit of a background about ableism. And as Dr. Meadows, as Phil has mentioned in her opening comments, at least 1 in 4 people living in the US have a disability, and the global statistics are quite high. Oftentimes we'll think of ableism or disability or chronic illness as things that impact other people, but in fact, the majority of people living on the globe have at least one chronic health condition. So it's a huge majority of the human population. And, you know, in these times, we're actually living in the midst of a massive disabling event. And you could argue that that's twofold, because at least 30 to 50 people who have survived COVID, which is 1.5 million people in the US alone, will be prone to or at risk for long COVID. And then in addition to that, we have the ongoing process of climate crisis happening, which is putting people in very precarious living conditions, which could in fact be disabling. And that's coupled with the conditions that are that are causing climate crisis, which is the persistent environmental racism and environmental toxicity that many of us are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So this is the kind of milieu of the ableist conditions that we're all in. So, to respond to these conditions, about 50 to 60 years ago, the disability rights movement emerged, which is an amazing movement that has enabled my life to be possible, and probably many of us here. There was a lot of essential wins, and from the ADA to the independent living movement, that's still a huge prominent of disability rights and disability justice communities. And there was what Patricia Byrne, the co-founder of Sins Invalid, talks about as cliffhangers from the disability rights movements. There was areas in which our communities as disabled people were not having our needs met. The needs and leadership of Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian Pacific Islander, and additional people of color were not being met. To be seen and recognized as honored as leaders, and the needs for voice and leadership also weren't being met regarding how ableism and the challenges that people with disabilities face. It's always already tied with racism and other forms of oppression. In addition, working class people and poor people, queer, trans, and non-binary people also weren't really centralized in the disability rights movements in the way that we truly aim to in disability justice. And of course, the disability justice movement was spearheaded by Black and Indigenous disabled people of color. And I am fortunate enough to be part of Sins Invalid, which is really looked upon as the organization and the orbit of people who have spearheaded, have launched the 10 disability justice principles, which I will address a little bit more in depth in a few moments. So this is really why the disability justice movement has come to be, to kind of uplift and amplify and expand upon the strengths and wins of disability rights, and be able to create a broader movement in which disabled people of color and queer and trans and non-binary people could have prominent leadership and voice for the benefit of all of us. And then I think the other core thing to really be aware of is that while the disability rights movement has enormous strength and ongoing importance, it's really centered in rights and legal frameworks and securing legal wins, which are essential. And disability justice wants to build upon that, honor that, and take it further to really centralize a justice framework and a justice-oriented vision for what's important for our communities and other communities. So we see that that decarceration and abolition are essential for disabled people and disability justice. We see that economic justice and racial justice are essential. We understand that disability justice is impossible until white supremacy is abolished, until the prison industrial complex is abolished, and we have better ways of caring for our communities and ensuring safety that aren't about punitive violence. And perhaps Marq will discuss this more, but vast amounts of police violence, particularly lethal cases, have been targeted against Black and Indigenous and additional people of color with disabilities by police forces across the US. So that's why disability justice really teaches us that we can understand safety and wellness for people with disabilities without all of these other fronts for justice simultaneously. And there are some core principles to help us understand how to get there and to help us orient our activism and our daily practices. And I know Dessa will be talking about implementation more in depth as well. If those of you are not familiar with Sins Invalid's Disability Justice Primer, I would strongly encourage you to familiarize yourself with it and get a copy. It is available for the modest price of $7 in its electronic version through Sins Invalid's website. And I really talk to my community members, my students when I'm teaching undergrad, my colleagues. I really talk about the Disability Justice Primer as required reading for our times. It overviews the 10 disability justice principles. It shares more about the history of the disability justice movement. And it also talks about implementation. And I have 1 minute left. So in that one moment, I'm going to just name out the 10 disability justice principles. Hopefully that can create a foundation for my co-panelists to be able to continue to expand upon what I've shared. So the 10 principles of disability justice are intersectionality, leadership of the most impacted, anti-capitalist politic, commitment to cross-movement organizing, recognizing wholeness, sustainability, commitment to cross-disability solidarity, interdependence, collective access, and finally, collective liberation. Thank you so much for your time, everyone. And I will pass it on to, I believe Mark. Was I correct?
I just wanted to thank you so much, Mordecai, for your insightful and thoughtful discussion of disability justice and its background. Thank you so much. And so now I'm going to be passing to Marq Mitchell as our next panelist. So Marq is the founder of Chainless Change, as Chris talked about earlier. And so I just want to kind of talk about how oftentimes folks see disability as a barrier rather than looking at society and the way that we create barriers for people with disabilities, especially folks with multiple marginalized identities. So just setting that up, I wanted to pass it to Marq to kind of discuss the various systemic barriers that folks face.
Thanks, Georgia, and thanks to everyone at the foundation for inviting me to share a bit about my experiences with disability and ableism. I'm Marq Mitchell. As mentioned, I lead Chainless Change. We are a South Florida-based recovery community organization that supports people with transitioning out of jails and prisons who have behavioral health conditions, including disabilities. And we organize towards ending mass incarceration and injustices, which often overlaps with the work that needs to be done to advance racial and disability justice. I am a brown man. I have on glasses. I have locks in my hair that are in a ponytail, and I am wearing a black and white shirt. Behind me, there is a off-white wall, half of a bookshelf, and a shelf. I identify as someone who has an invisible disability. I spent much of my life in and interacting with systems, particularly the criminal legal system. And for that reason, I'll be sharing a bit about systemic and institutional ableism, and how it overlaps with the criminal legal system. I won't say the justice system because it is void of justice. And I'll share a bit about things that we can do to create a better world for people living with disabilities. When I think of systemic and institutional ableism, what comes to mind is the creation of systems and policies that favor those who are able-bodied and able-minded, without taking into account or consideration the ways in which people who live with disabilities will experience those same systems and structures. Ableism rests upon other forms of oppression, like Mordecai mentioned, classism, racism, white supremacy, and capitalism. And just thinking a little more about what it means to live as a person with disabilities, I understand that society developed the world in a way in which folks with disabilities are disadvantaged, and disability in itself is a social construct. There's no denying that most places in society have been developed in ways that make it difficult for the needs of people with disabilities to be met. It's also a lot more difficult, if not nearly for some, impossible for people with disabilities to live, work, play, and exist without being disadvantaged or feeling like they are a burden. This touches every aspect of folks' lives, including the media, workforce, schools, housing community, especially what is considered as affordable housing, social service providers, medical institutions, as well as healthcare. These systems were designed without people with disabilities at the table. And for that reason, there are tons of negative downstream effects, including criminalization and unwarranted contact with the criminal legal system. Although 1 in 4 adults in the US live with disabilities, roughly 25%, there are upward of 40% of people in jails and prisons who report having at least one disability. Because I am someone whose system's involved, I'm going to just share a little bit from that lens. Due to stigma and sometimes the inability to identify and articulate our experiences, there are likely many more people with disabilities who are not represented in that group of 40% who are in institutions. Cognitive impairments, which I live with, are not often understood or considered to be disabled conditionings. And so for that reason, people with cognitive disabilities are less likely to be identified as someone who is disabled. And how did we get here? When I think about the way in which folks are criminalized and coming into contact with the criminal legal system, I have to consider how many of the behaviors and experiences related to disability are often criminalized. For example, homelessness, people with disability are more likely to live below the poverty line and experience a multitude of challenges with accessing and maintaining stable employment. It should be noted that less than 20% of people with disabilities are employed, and many of them are filling part-time positions. This disparity increases the likelihood of experiencing homelessness and chronic homelessness, and being unhoused significantly increases the likelihood of contact with law enforcement, especially for victimless misdemeanor offenses that stem from vacancy laws such as loitering and prowling. I think about substance use and possession of substances that people with disabilities may use to manage pain being criminalized, and how that increases contact with law enforcement. And even more so, atypical reactions to social cues also increases the likelihood of arrest and incarceration. Examples of this being someone who can't hear not responding to law enforcement, or a person who has a disability that causes body movement being identified as resistant, threatening, or violent. And because police are militarized and often the first responders to crises, more than half of the victims in police shootings include someone who is living with a disability. And if disabled people do encounter law enforcement and survive, we then face access to, or a lack of access to, participation in the court system. Also, there is a heightened risk of false confessions and accurate assumptions about competency and credibility, inappropriate placement in institutions, and the unknowing waiver of rights. That then reminds me of my own experience of being shuffled through a system where I was expected to understand, expected to know how to respond, but not provided with the tools and information or supports needed in order to navigate such a complex system. And while jailed, I understand and witness people with disabilities who were disadvantaged by a lack of equipment, prosthetics, wheelchairs, assertive technologies, and all of the things that they needed to function, but were considered medically unnecessary by institutions. Furthermore, when jailed, people with disabilities are more vulnerable to abuse, isolation, and solitary confinement. And even when released, there are many challenges with accessing the appropriate life-stabilizing and reentry supports that are needed, those programs that were not designed to adequately address the needs of people with disabilities. And so when thinking about ableism and all of the challenges that are posed and barriers that are posed for people who are living with disabilities, I think, how do we fix this? And the reality is fixing it really starts where the problems begin, thinking through intentional practices and policies that bolster inclusion and access for people with disabilities in spaces where they're currently excluded, ensuring that those areas that I mentioned before, the media, workforce, healthcare, housing, social services, and medical institution make space and opportunity for people with disabilities to access exactly what they need to live and thrive, and trusting the lived experience and allowing people who are most impacted by exclusion to be a part of the process of developing solutions that are created with the intention of making life more accessible. I know that I'm probably out of time, so I'll put a pin in it and pass it over to Georgia to take it from here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marq. That was just an amazing overview of the ways that society creates barriers for people with disabilities. And I appreciate you sharing your experience. So now I'm going to be passing it to Dessa of Detroit Disability Power. And Dessa is going to give us some ways that we can start to weave anti-ableism into our culture and into the fabrics of like the philanthropic sector and the nonprofit sector. So I'll pass it to you, Dessa. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Georgia. And thanks to everyone who made today possible. I'm really glad to be here with you. I am Dessa. As was said, I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the director of Detroit Disability Power. I'm a white woman in my early 40s with long blonde hair, wearing a blue hoodie, sitting in front of my fireplace here in my house on the east side of Detroit. And when I started thinking about the question of, how do we ensure that we're taking an anti-ableist or disability justice approach to work in philanthropy and nonprofits, the first thing that came to mind for me was why I started Detroit Disability Power in the first place. And some of you know I have been in social justice work for a long time. And about after 15 years of organizing and political work, economic justice, environmental justice, racial justice, reproductive justice, all these very meaningful, important justice movements. After doing that for about 15 years as a disabled person, so I am a wheelchair user and I'm a little person, so I'm about 3.5 feet tall. I'm very obviously disabled, but not on Zoom. After about 15 years of doing this work as a disabled woman, I started feeling really lonely and isolated. And I started wondering, like, where are my fellow disabled people in this work? I know they must be here. I'm not seeing people. People aren't speaking from that perspective. These campaigns are not uplifting my community, even though there's this dedication and these values around uplifting marginalized people, having people with multiple marginalized identities leading the work. I wasn't seeing that being applied to disability. And I felt like not only was this counter to our values, but it also was really unstrategic. So if we're trying to craft solutions to get at the root of problems, and we're not including some of the most marginalized people in our society in that, well, then what are we doing? If we're trying to win campaigns and we need people power, we need votes, we need new ideas, and we're not including disabled people, which are a huge part of the population, like, what are we doing? And so when I would bring this up, I would typically get one of two answers. I would get, oh, you're right, Dessa. We really should do that. And then radio silence, like no ideas, no commitment, nothing, just like, oh yeah. And the other thing that I would get would be, you know what, you're right, but right now we're talking about gender, or right now we're talking about race. And I would think to myself, well, I have a race and I have a gender, and so does every other disabled person on this planet, right? So what do you mean we're not, I'm not changing the subject. I'm actually adding to the conversation. I'm actually making the conversation whole by bringing in disability. I'm actually adding something here that's very valuable to the work that we do. And so this is one of the ways that ableism shows up, not recognizing disabled folks as a constituency of marginalized people, framing disability as an individual problem that needs to be solved by individual people, when in actuality, everything that we've said today uplifts ableism as a systemic system of oppression. And so I started Detroit Disability Power both to organize disabled folks around issues like housing, voting rights, education, healthcare access, and to help transform the social justice movement landscape and ecosystem to be one that actually has a disability justice analysis and praxis. And so that's the two-pronged work of my organization. And I really, when I started Detroit Disability Power, which was only 4 years ago, I was very dubious about my ability to raise money for this, because having been an executive director before, I knew how funding worked, at least to some degree. And I also knew that there was very little information or knowledge around disability in philanthropy, to the point that I was pretty worried that I wouldn't actually be able to fund my organization. I'm going to talk about that more in just a sec. But the big picture here is that there is this really pervasive general ignorance around disability itself, around accommodations, around disability culture and history and experience. And this is all part of the invisibility that our community faces despite being so large. So as has been said, we're this large community, we're part of every other community. So we're incredibly diverse in terms of type of disability and other parts of our identities. And we are literally everywhere on the planet. And somehow we're still in the shadows, largely ignored and neglected. And this is because of stigma and bias and shame around disability. And as a result, disabled folks are losing. Like, we're not doing well as a group. As you've heard from the previous two panelists today, but also everyone else is not doing as well because we're not doing well. Like, we are value added to community, we are value added to social change spaces. So not having us in the mix, not having our ideas and our wisdom and our humor and our work towards justice, not having that in the mix is actually a detriment to everyone. And so ableism frames disability as a deficit frames disabled people as pitiable and needy. And then combined with patriarchy and white supremacy and hyper-individualism, ableism also frames our struggles as ours alone, or just to be solved by us or our immediate family, rather than acknowledging the systemic failures that got us to where we are today as a group. And so when it comes to thinking about disability, if we're thinking about disability in the framework of charity, which is, I think, pretty common, let's help those poor people, that vibe, right? Which I can tell you, to be on the receiving end is pretty awful. But to frame disability in terms of charity, or by solely funding social services that serve disabled people, rather than funding power building efforts, civic engagement, systems change work, social justice work, we're just not getting at the root of our problems. We're actually perpetuating a narrative about who disabled people are, which is wrong and dehumanizing, rather than actually working towards justice. So the kind of bogus and insidious thinking that I've just described, of course, it seeps into most organizations' theories of change. So whether you're a nonprofit or philanthropic institution, you know, this kind of thinking is embedded in the way you do your work, unless you have done a lot of work to explicitly unlearn and dismantle it. So it shows up in how nonprofits and philanthropies operate, what work they prioritize, who they see as leaders, and where they put their resources. And all of this requires massive interrogation. So recent data shows, this is from 2017, so hopefully it's getting updated soon, but 2017 data shows that only 2% of Human Rights Foundation funding went towards disability-related efforts. That includes grants for services, charity, and civic engagement. So 2% for all of that for 25% of the world's population and some of the most marginalized people on earth. That alone shows that we have a long way to go. So I want to quickly run through 3 ways that I see ableism showing up in philanthropy specifically. And if you're a nonprofit on the call, you are a recipient of funding. And so this also applies to you as well. So one way is in internal operations and staffing. So are the processes that your organization use accessible and navigable for people with a variety of disabilities? Are your grant-making processes navigable, accessible, convenient for people with a variety of disabilities? Are you funding accommodations specifically? I always recommend that organizations have a line item in their budget for accommodations so that when they need the money, it's there and a disabled person doesn't end up losing out because somebody didn't plan ahead. Is your organization supporting disabled staff? Is there professional development and learning opportunities for all of your team about ableism and disability justice? So that's one category, this internal operations and staffing. Secondly, I see a lot of room for improvement in funding disability organizations, specifically those led by people of color that are disabled. So by not understanding that we're a constituency of folks in dire need of systems change, the work you're doing is not going to get at the root of the problem. So our organizations need funding to do the critical work in our communities, and also to help non-disabled people understand how much work needs to be done on their part. Also in this category of not funding disability groups would be a kind of misunderstanding that is very pervasive, that thinks of disabled people as one-dimensional. But in fact, we are multifaceted, meaning that we have lots of components to who we are and what we care about. We don't just care about quote unquote disability issues, although I would argue that every issue is a disability issue. Some of us want to work specifically on environmental justice or specifically on criminal legal reform or whatever, right? We shouldn't be siloed because of this part of our identity. It's really important when funding other justice work to remember that all issues have a disability angle and that disabled folks are value added to these movements, bringing needed perspective and co-creating solutions. And I want to tell a really quick story because a couple of years ago, I ran into a colleague who had recently started working at a large foundation. And I mentioned that my organization might reach out about some funding. And they said, oh, I don't really think that's a good fit. We focus on racial justice. And I thought, oh, what a profound misunderstanding. Like, who did she think in Detroit was disabled? Right. So there's 106,000 disabled African Americans in our city, 6,600 disabled Latinx folks, and 1,000 Asian Americans with disabilities. That's a vast majority of the disabled people in Detroit. To think that those folks are not also dealing with systemic ableism and racism is really it's a misunderstanding. It's a problem. And then finally, the third kind of theme I see is not holding non-disability groups to standards around disability and accessibility. So do other organizations that you fund have disabled folks on their staff and board? Are they doing their work in an accessible, inclusive way? Are they getting the needed training around how to dismantle ableism as a part of their foundational work? And so these are some problems that I've seen that I think they're probably familiar to you all. And a few very quick things to do to push back on this. So learn about disability communities where you are and build relationships in those communities, not just one relationship, but many relationships. Learn from disabled leaders in your community and beyond. Learn how we have always been parts of social justice movements and contributed to those movements and continue to contribute. Start unpacking the inevitable ableism that operates in your organization, and make commitments with your colleagues to do things differently moving forward. And invest in disability justice work, not siloing us in the process. As a group, disabled folks are doing extremely poorly. This is not inevitable. We cannot fall into the trap of thinking that our doing poorly is inevitable, because it's not. It's a set of choices, and we can totally make different choices.
Thank you so much, Dessa. That was absolutely amazing. And I really appreciate the concrete steps that folks in philanthropy and the nonprofit sector can take to start to weave anti-racism into their work. And I want to remind folks, we have this recorded. We're going to write a commentary after, because I feel like I should have been taking notes. You were like really giving us some great education. So thank you so much. So for this next part, we're going to start with some questions. So for those in the audience, if you have a question, you can put it into the chat, or there's a Q&A button on the little toolbar at the bottom. So enter those either way that you can. So while you're thinking of those, I'm going to start with just a couple of my own questions until we start getting things in the chat. So my first question is, there's this idea of forced intimacy, where folks with disabilities are kind of forced to be vulnerable. They're forced to kind of give, private medical information, really go into maybe their mental health background, just to get the bare necessities. And you see that in employment. Obviously as funders, we kind of see that like with grantees having to kind of reveal these things. How can we improve accessibility and increase awareness of disability inclusion while also trying to avoid this exploitative notion of forced intimacy?
I'll take it. When I think about forced intimacy and ways to avoid it, something that comes to mind with the work that we're doing in our organization. As I previously mentioned, we support people with transitioning and do that power building work. But oftentimes when people are in need of certain supports, they are pretty much asked to get naked, explain everything about their situations and explain why they need certain adjustments to be made for them to be comfortable. And then, folks who are not living with these experiences try to think of other solutions or shortcuts to just providing a person with what they need. Even as an organization, we're going through this period of growth where we're moving out of a smaller space into a larger one. And that's needed, and wanting to be sure that we have accessible facilities for people. And when talking to the property owners and trying to ensure that we did what was needed for our community, there was this constant need to explain, well, why do you need a large bathroom? Why do you need a rail in the bathroom? Can someone just help them into there and help them out? And acting as if making the adjustments that are needed for people who live with these experiences are really an inconvenience for others. And so I think by just embracing folks' needs and allowing people who have these experiences to access what they need in order to be comfortable without having to meet any pre-qualifiers is important. Stop asking personal questions and just trust that folks know what they need to live and to thrive. Then the other, I would say, when we think about interpersonal forced intimacy is, asking people, is it okay if I, touch you? Some folks don't like to be touched, right? Some folks don't want you in their personal spaces. So having a conversation and understanding folks' parameters and boundaries and what might trigger or make a person feel uncomfortable, I think is important for avoiding forced intimacy, and certainly just stop asking people to share their most vulnerable parts of their being, their existence with you, if that's not something that they're ready to do, or making it a prerequisite in order for them to get what they need.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that and for those examples, Mark. Chris, I saw you come off of mute, so I will let you.
No, Dessa came off mute earlier. I'm not sure if she wanted to answer that question as well.
Oh yeah, sure. This is Dessa. I
Really
love what
one sec. Also, Georgia, please. The chat feature, I'm not sure it's working for now, but the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, please put your questions in there until we get the other one resolved. Sorry for interrupting, Dessa.
No, all good. Thank you. This is Dessa. I love what Mark said, and I think two ways that I would respond to this question are, one is like just having a high standard of accessibility at all times, like making what the very minimum of what you're doing extremely accessible to begin with is a way to lessen the emotional load and labor of disabled folks who are trying to navigate. So if we don't have to request things all the time because they're provided, or if we can take for granted, like, I'm going to go to this event my organization is happening, I'm going to be able to get in the door, move around, get in the bathroom, communicate with people, breathe the air. If we have high standards of accessibility to begin with, we can lessen this kind of intrusive line of questioning that often comes our way. And secondly, just creating cultures of care. If we can create cultures in our organizations that allow people to show up as who they are in their fullness with all the messiness of what that means, and ask for help when we need it and help each other when people need it. If we're creating that kind of relationship and culture of meeting folks where they are, knowing that that can change from day to day for people as well, where people feel safe saying, like, I don't feel well today. My productivity is going to be less today, and it's going to be okay. Like, having that kind of culture of care where we support each other is another way that will help disabled people, but actually we're helping all people. And I think all of this stuff that we're saying today helps non-disabled people too. because all human bodies have need and all human bodies require care.
Thank you. And Mordecai, would you like to answer as well?
Thank you, Chris. This is Mordecai. The responses from Marq and Dessa were very powerful. I'm not sure how much more I have to add, but I do want to reiterate that it's a consequence of intersectional ableism that people would be scrutinized, or the needs of disabled people, whatever they are, would be scrutinized, or would be subject to this added onus of explanation. So it is about a culture shift that really centers disability justice, where that is in alignment with communities of care that benefits everyone, where we do honor the expertise of the person in front of us, and we don't need an explanation to make it actionable. We just actually take the responsibility to make it so, and know that it's valid and that it's important, because we actually want to create communities designed around universal access. You know, we want to, accommodations are so essential, and building for that proactively, as Dessa mentioned, is essential. And also cultivating the practices and the mindsets and the commitment to universal access to everyone can continue to take that further, to really deepen the disability tools and practices that we have available to us. And universal access is one of or collective access is part of the 10 disability justice principles. So you can learn more about that if you want to check out the primer. There's also an access guide that is part of that document as well. But I think it's just so important to understand that it is a concrete manifestation of ableism, that people have had to bear this continual burden, and we should take every action possible to not just alleviate this, but to disrupt it, and be very conscious of the fact that this makes our communities stronger, and more care oriented and humane for all of us. And certainly more just. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for your thoughtful answers. So I see within the Q&A, there's quite a few people that are asking kind of like similar things. And it's about like employment and workplace culture. So specifically, how can organizations start to move towards inclusiveness? Are there any resources or organizations that do these types of training, which I know Mordecai, the Sins Invalid book you recommended, I put in the chat earlier, and Dessa, I'll let you talk about this, but I know Detroit Disability Power also does trainings. So that was one part of the question. And then another is, especially moving, as some folks are seeing the pandemic as over, how can people with invisible disabilities also navigate these tricky times? So I know that's a multiple part question, but just about how can we start to make our workplaces more inclusive?
This is Dessa. I can jump in with one quick thought, although I think there's probably a lot more. I think flexibility in general is the key to success in life. Specifically for disabled folks. So the things that people with disabilities, myself included, have to do to navigate the world, what a lot of people would call like the most basic things, going to the grocery store, getting to school in the morning, making breakfast. Those can be really time consuming and really challenging in the current reality for folks with disabilities. And that's because our houses are not accessible, our transportation is not accessible, our infrastructure was built without us in mind, right? We might face discrimination every step along the way, just getting to work in the morning, right? And so flexibility is really important. A workplace culture that, as we said a minute ago, is focused on care and being our whole selves and collaboratively solving problems. That's a really important And part of that is the flexibility piece. So if a job doesn't need to be done in a certain place, it can be done from home. If someone is running a little late or needs to reschedule, is it really the end of the world? If a person isn't feeling well, can they do the thing later? In most cases, the answer to that stuff is yes. Like, we actually have a higher level of flexibility than we allow ourselves to think we do in our work culture and under capitalism. And so really, I run an organization. I have to make sure we have enough money. I have to make sure we fulfill all of our deliverables. But I'm more focused, honestly, on making sure that my team are treated like human beings and are allowed to be their full human self than anything else. And when I can, kind of love my team in that way, providing them with the accommodations and the culture that allows them to do their best work and to feel human in the process, I know that the output of my organization is stronger, more meaningful, and more compelling. And so I really focus on creating a culture of care and flexibility, and trusting that my team, as Mordecai said, there's a trust involved here, trusting that my team is going to do magic with that. And they never let me down.
So thank you so much, Dessa. Mordecai or Mark, I don't know if y'all had anything that you wanted to add to that question, specifically about just creating an environment of accessibility and inclusion within employment or within the workplace.
I think that what Dessa shared about just ensuring that you had high standards of accessibility for your organization across the board is really critical, right? Because explaining your experience, your disability is exhausting. And folks don't want to have to constantly explain and ask for accommodations. One of the things that I found helpful after solicited feedback from our team is that having a structured roadmap of tasks, what things should look like from day to day, week to week, has been really helpful for our folks. And then being able to add virtual contact into the mix. Everyone, even though we've kind of gotten to a space where a lot of us are returning to the office, giving people options, understanding that sometimes just because a person does have accessibility needs, and it may feel as if they'd be more comfortable at home, that they may not necessarily want to be isolated in that way and want to feel included in the community and wants to be present with others. And there's others who, like me, who have a predisposition to stress because of my experience. And I sometimes just want to avoid the commute and avoid, the crowd. And so being flexible and open to allowing people to state their needs, I think creates a more welcoming workplace for folks who have disabilities, and wanting to be sure that there's an environment when folks are not fearful about expressing what their needs are. I think that with the correct measures in place and a open mind, that we can then start to create spaces in which people with disabilities can thrive. And again, just trusting and creating space for people to say what makes them comfortable, what their needs are, and not questioning it. Just being able, to the best of your ability, to make the necessary adjustments. And that then requires funding, right? Supporting and sustaining this work in sustaining accessibility features for the work that you're doing, I think is critical, and it requires an investment of resources and time. And so understanding that, that falls under the capacity of an organization, or increasing the capacity of the entities, just having that investment in the necessary accommodations, and being able to invest in what it is that your folks need to be comfortable is a key component to being effective in this work.
Great. I wanted to kind of hit on a theme that each of you presented over the past hour, and is the varied experiences, like the intersectionality of your work. Each of you have interests that are not just disability justice, no matter how much our society tries to pigeonhole each and every one of us into one thing. Dessa, when you talked about the disability justice fight in Detroit, and talking to someone who does racial advocacy, and you're like, that's such a narrow approach to who do you think those with disabilities are. I mean, that struck me, like that was powerful. And I think too often we fail to recognize that the intersectionality of each and every one of us. We had a question in the chat from Benji. I was talking about the notions of solidarity and collective liberation, and how have our colleagues experienced the pursuit of these ideals in their own work? How have you done it? And I honestly I'm just interested in how do we center these experiences, and how do we add the nuance to a discussion that is so often painted with just one stroke, one color, when these experiences add such a rich diversity, and it perfects it really. So I'll open that question to the floor.
All right, I guess I'll take that question. I think, just recognizing that disability justice work is about, from my perspective, being intersectional, understanding that there are multiple oppressed identities and marginalized identities that folks are experiencing who live with disabilities. And some of those identities might, rise to the surface when having interactions with others, and thinking about what needs and what work has to be done to make this world better for the individual. I think that, all of justice is just intertwined. We want to think through health justice and economic and racial justice, and move to a space where community care is possible through abolition, right? I am all for dismantling the systems that perpetuate harms that currently exist, and investing the resources for communities to create systems that work for them. And those will look different everywhere, because the needs of all of our communities are going to look a little different. But I think, there's no way to do this work without understanding that there has to be investment in housing justice and racial justice and economic justice, ensuring that people have equitable access to participate in the workforce, because all of those overlapping challenges in society affect people who live with disabilities. And because we are people who have disabilities, whether visible or invisible, we are probably going to be at a further deficit when it comes to any of those situations as well. So there may need to be an even greater investment in the resources and the capacity for us to challenge all inequities across the board.
Thank you so much, Mark. I don't know if Dessa or Mordecai, if y'all have anything else you would like to add to that question.
Dessa, did you want to add anything? Okay. This is Mordecai speaking, everyone. I think that's a great question. I think to some extent, the conditions that we are living in and under are so intertwined and complex. The first thing that we can do is, hold a dream or the seed of aspiration for collective liberation in our mind and our heart. That is a place to begin. That's really essential, to just commit to that it's possible, that we deserve it, that each and every one of us deserves it, that our future deserves it, that our ancestors on some level have our backs and want this for us, and that humanity really requires this of us in these times. And it really does get back to the wholeness that Dessa spoke to, and that is also spoken to and uplifted in the disability justice principles, that when we see ourselves and one another in our wholeness, collective liberation becomes not just only essential, but hopefully also inevitable, because it's really the conditions of this society that create this divisions of these different identities through the targeting, through the stigma, through the kind of persistent and historic and ongoing discrimination and oppression. And societies are complex ecosystems. And just as in a complex ecosystem, all the conditions are interconnected and self-reinforcing. So the conditions that we are living in are incredibly disabling, as I spoke to in my own opening comments. And we would be profoundly remiss to not recognize that that it's not only things like viruses and the pandemic that are disabling, or environmental crises and environmental pollution and racism that are disabling, but also the very conditions of oppression themselves on our bodies. They are disabling. So when we recognize that this collective liberation is really essential for our survival. And we have to understand that when we're working towards racial justice or abolition, or if we're doing the work in the different communities or social justice sectors or philanthropic sectors that we may be engaged in, it's always already connected to these other aspirations and efforts for justice. And when we can make this work more overt, and we can engage in more intentional solidarity, when we can stop engaging in the invisibilization of our communities. Again, I would mention several of the examples that Mark and Dessa brought up. Of course, when we talk about disability justice, it's racial justice. It's looking towards making significant change and transformation to behavioral health and the way that people who have survived systems can continue to thrive in their lives. These things are inextricable. So when we begin to think differently, know that something else is possible, then we can also take action differently, and hopefully in more coordinated and collected and committed ways.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mordecai. Dessa, I don't want to, if you have something that you would like to say, I don't want to jump. Okay, cool. So I had another question in the chat. And so we know that a lot of disabilities are invisible. And I think sometimes, when organizations are focusing on disability inclusion, it's very often, I would say, more of the visible disabilities that kind of they want to tackle first. But how can we go deeper than that? Specifically, neurodiversity, mental health. How can we, figure out ways to make the workplace more inclusive for these folks, and B, also foster a sense of trust within organization where people feel comfortable saying, hey, I have an invisible disability. Here's what I need for support. So that's another two-pronged question. So if any of y'all could speak to that.
This is Dessa. I can speak to part of that, which is just that in some of the limitations that Mordecai laid out when talking about the disability rights movement, one of the things that I also see as a historical trend, even within disability movements, has been to prioritize certain types of disabilities over others. That means that, you know, wheelchair users, for example, and in some ways blind folks, some people with like this kind of, I think, understandable to the outsider, some little more understandable to the outsider perspective groups have had more power in disability spaces and have had more access outside of disability spaces. And that's also been true of white people in disability movements and people with more resources, cisgender people, men, you know, like there's all of to everything we've been saying, it works in both directions. So even in our own spaces over time, there has been a problem recognizing and uplifting the full diversity of disability experience. And so I think, you know, it's very important to me, and I think to all of us here, that we're not further marginalizing our own folks by not recognizing some of the less well understood disabilities, and particularly mental health disabilities and chronic illness are kind of categories of disability that a lot of people don't even think of as disabilities, but those folks need accommodations. Those folks need to be seen and recognized as folks who navigate the world differently and have value to bring to our movement spaces. And so I think part of it is recognizing and really honoring the full diversity of our community. And that means learning about, you know, just as a wheelchair user who's been disabled my entire life, I have some intuition and some wisdom that is across disability, but I also had to learn stuff. You know, the first time I had a deaf colleague, I had a lot to learn, and I did my homework, and I'm now much better about that. But, you know, it requires learning and a commitment to learning. And it also requires a commitment to not leaving people behind. And I think this is something I really appreciate about Sins Invalid. This notion of like not leaving people behind has been a really huge addition to my own political analysis. Like, how do we build everything we're doing in a way that doesn't leave people behind? And that means people with disabilities that I don't understand very well, or people with experiences that are different than mine. What can I do to make sure that folks are getting what they need, have I'm trying to think of that word, have the ability to be in charge and like make decisions and have like real meaningful engagement? How can I help co-create a space that does that? That's a huge piece of it, but it's not all of it. That's just a little bit.
Great, thank you so much, Dessa. Oh, Mordecai, go ahead.
I just wanted to say as well that in the way that you framed the question, Georgia, there's some things that maybe we can learn together. The ideal situation could be that a person doesn't have to state, I have an invisible disability and this is what I need. They should instead just be able to state, this is what I need, right? Because again, we shouldn't have to find ourselves in situations in the workplace and anywhere in our communities where we have to kind of over disclose. And I think, you know, in any context, us, as Dessa said, doing our homework, so we are aware what people might be needing, you know, in terms of disabilities or impairments that have to do with neurodiversity or chemical intolerances or environmental illness or other types of immune illnesses or things of that nature that we might think of as invisible disabilities. So, you know, there could be places in offices that are calming for people with sensory or perceptual impairments. So low lights are able to have sunlight and the lights off. that it's a quieter space, that there are fragrance-free areas in workplaces. And these can just be that the cleaning supplies used in offices are fragrance-free, that the soaps available in offices, these things can just become general practices that, again, that are supportive for the entire community. And then the onus, and it's better for everyone, and it relieves the onus from any single individual. And then, disabled people, we are excellent problem solvers. So if those things aren't possible, then another solution might be, which, working from home and things of that nature. And I think another thing that's really essential to remember in these times is that the pandemic is not over. It is an ongoing pandemic. The pervasive denial around the pandemic, even when 500 people per day are continuing to perish, is a terrible outpicturing of ableism. And it is, regardless of the nature of our disabilities, this is an incredibly difficult time for people. Almost across the board, regardless of our type of disabilities, we're at higher risk for COVID or long COVID, or just having more difficulty negotiating society and the world, given this kind of this amplification of ableism and intersectional ableism. So I think that's really important as well. So in our workspaces, in philanthropic spaces, it's really important in these times to take extra care, to be able to kind of up our game around these issues and make more resources available. So, if people are going to be working late, this might be a great time to institute a practice where everyone gets a meal. It's like a very reasonable fringe benefits for your workers. And if people aren't working, if people are working virtually, then send people food, send people groceries, make sure people have enough masks, access to tests, things of that nature that we can consider to be accommodation or access support, but that our communities will, again, benefit from universally.
Thank you so much. And thank you for giving really good concrete examples. I appreciate that. And all of you have done such an amazing job with just showing us how to operationalize, disability justice within our personal and professional lives. So I want to thank you all. So we are coming kind of close to the close. So I was thinking, and shout out to Phyllis for this idea. I was wondering if y'all all wanted to go around and maybe do a round robin of just closing thoughts, after the discussion that we have had today, just anything else you think, is important for folks to hear. And I know I put you on the spot, so just jump in whenever you have something.
And there was a thread of questions too, and maybe the last tangent of thoughts can circle around the challenges of funding community-specific and intersectional organizations that focus on these long-term goals of, changing and dismantling oppressive systems. So the operationalization of the work, especially with each of you leading nonprofit organizations, maybe that is something that we could talk about.
Mark and I, this is Dessa. Mark and I are being polite right now. You. Okay, I'll go. So this is Dessa, and I guess, kind of in closing, a couple of things are coming to mind. One is something that I already said that I just think bears repeating. The situation we're in is not inevitable. There's absolutely things we can do to make the world a better place for disabled folks and other marginalized people. And I think that it's really imperative that we interrogate the ableist thinking that we are surrounded by. And so in ableist logic, somebody could very legitimately say, well, yeah, of course that person isn't doing as well. They can't walk, or they can't think like me, or they don't speak like I do, right? Of course they're not doing well. That's ableist logic. It's incredibly pervasive. When the pandemic first began, if you all think back to what the dominant narrative was, it was, don't worry, it's just the sick and old people that will die. And so many people didn't think twice about that narrative. But those of us who are disabled, and I'm sure elders, that like struck fear in our heart because it was an explicit expression of what we knew to be already true, which is that we're disposable and that we're not as important in the eyes of our society as other people. So we already knew that, I think largely, but to have it said so clearly, I think provides an opportunity for us to really examine and have a conversation about why was that even okay? And to Mordecai's point, why is this notion of like going back to normal, the pandemic is over, so devoid of care for people like us who are more likely to get sick and die from COVID? And that's because, it's a lot of things. It's a combination of all the isms we've been talking about. It's also an overcommitment to productivity over humane practices and enjoying life and surviving. But, I think whenever we don't question this dominant narrative about the value or lack of value of disabled people, we're doing a disservice, not just to disabled people, but to all people, because we're all human beings. We all have to be cared for. And what we have done collectively is set up a society that makes it easier for some people to get what they need than others. And again, we can totally change that. I think for me, disability justice, a political analysis with disability justice has opened up my mind tremendously in this beautiful way of being able to imagine and vision something that's so radically different than what we have, that it gets me out of bed every morning. I get excited about co-creating that world where people get what they need and can be happy and thrive. It's so different than the world that we live in. But to Mordecai's point, disabled folks are excellent at problem solving. We have to creatively solve problems to go to the grocery store, right? So A, we should be in charge. And B, if we were, the world would be a lot easier and better for everyone. So putting time and resources to building up the power of the disability community is really an investment in creating a community that works better for everyone.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dessa. I see we have 4 minutes left, so I'm going to pass it to Marq and Mordecai really quick for y'all's final thoughts.
Yeah, for my final thoughts, I'll just say, that just like the world and the conditions that we're living in were created by people, accessibility and justice can also be created right now. This disability justice has to happen. And even taking into account folks who have invisible disabilities, oftentimes because you're not seen in a wheelchair or using supportive devices, folks will discount your experience or seek to invalidate your experience. And I think that it's equally as important to make investment in wholeness for folks who have the invisible disabilities as well as folks who have visible disabilities. And for folks working in the philanthropic spaces, I think, just being a lot more open to organizations and being willing to open the doors and have conversations and learn more about the issues, the problems that they're experiencing, how they're intersectional, and how philanthropy can actually take small steps that'll make a huge, huge difference. As a leader of a very small nonprofit, we face a lot of rejection and knowing that already because of our conditions in the world, folks are discounting us, rejecting us, and then to try to do meaningful work and constantly be faced with no's and you're not worthy. It's sometimes disarming and further disabling and discouraging for folks. And so just think about the impacts in which philanthropy and the way that philanthropy operates can have either negative or positive impacts on folks with disabilities, and determine what impact you want to have on those individuals, those organizations, as well as the lives that they are housed within those groups.
Thank you so much, Mark and Dessa, and to the foundation for welcoming us. I would just say to make persistent attempts to integrate disability justice and the leadership of disabled people, especially disabled people of color and queer and trans and non-binary disabled people, in your organizations internally and in the philanthropic sectors that you serve. If you do not already have a disability or disability justice funding sector, please create one. And then please develop the disability justice practices within your own organization. And Sins Invalid offers training and consultation in these areas. And I am certain that my fellow panelists and their fine organizations that I highly recommend offer that as well. So there are resources available to you and your organizations to deepen your commitment to disability justice and to put these ideas in practices and put disabled first and understand us as being part of every community, every justice community that you're working in and for. Thank you so much.
Awesome. I just want to give just one more thank you so much to all of our amazing panelists. And thank you for all of the wisdom and the insight y'all shared today. And thank you to everybody who came out to learn more about disability justice. And with that, I will say, have a great day and have a safe weekend. Bye.